The silence of the Soviet embassy was a lie. It was a heavy, manufactured thing, thick with the smell of floor wax and suspicion. Andrei Volkov was the only man who knew all its secrets. He moved through the marble halls, not like he owned them, but like he was part of the architecture, a silent, observing pillar. To the junior diplomats, he was a helpful mentor. To the KGB guards, he was a harmless bureaucrat, a man who spent more time with paperwork than with people. They saw his calm eyes and quiet smile. They never saw the ghost living behind them. His name was Adam Rice, and for the past 8 years, he had been conducting a symphony of betrayal from within this granite fortress. Tonight was the crescendo. The bi-monthly diplomatic pouch from Moscow had arrived. His part of the ritual was to log the new cipher tables, the cryptographic lifeblood of the entire Soviet intelligence network in North America. These books would dictate every secret message, every agent movement, every stolen secret from Seattle to Miami for the next 60 days. In the secure room, the air was cold and still. The case sat on the steel table. He opened it. Inside, nestled in gray foam, were 2 identical unmarked books. One was genuine. The other, his masterpiece, was a forgery so perfect only a machine at Langley could tell the difference. His hands were steady as he began the swap. But his mind was not. A memory, sharp and unbidden, flashed behind his eyes. Not a face, but a sensation. The biting cold of a Berlin winter. The rough grip of a soldier pulling his little sister Katerina away from him. Her small gloved hand slipping from his. The sound of her crying his real name, Adam, until it was swallowed by the wind. That was 30 years ago. The silence that followed had never left him. This was for her, for every letter he wrote that was never answered, for the life she was forced to live behind the Iron Curtain. This was his revenge, patient and cold. He was halfway through, the real book exposed for his camera, when he heard it. A firm, deliberate knock on the door. Not the soft tap of the regular security officer. This was a punch of knuckles on steel. His blood turned to ice. Protocol was absolute. No interruptions. Before he could speak, the lock turned. The door swung open. Standing there was Colonel Grigory Morozov, the KGB resident. A man built like a bull, with a flat, brutal face and eyes that missed nothing. His gaze swept the room, inventorying the open case, the 2 cipher books, the pen in Andrei's hand that was not just a pen. The world shrunk to the space between them. Andrei's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. This was it. Exposure. Death. Morozov stepped inside, letting the door sigh shut. The click was the loudest sound Andrei had ever heard. Andrei. Morozov's voice was a low rumble, devoid of emotion. A problem with the materials? He walked closer, his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum. He stopped on the other side of the table, his shadow falling over the evidence of treason. He picked up the real cipher book, his thick fingers brushing the pages Andrei had just photographed. Andrei's training screamed at him to explain, to lie, but his throat was sealed shut. Any word would be a confession. Morozov flipped a page, his eyes scanning the complex codes. He then looked directly at Andrei. The silence stretched, thin and sharp as a razor wire. "Your work is always so meticulous," Morozov said, his tone unreadable. He placed the book back into the foam, not in its original spot, but right next to the forgery. A subtle, terrifying gesture. He knew. Then he turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob. "Do not be long. We have the Bulgarian cultural attaché arriving. I need your ears sharp." The door closed. Andrei stood frozen, the echo of the colonel's words hanging in the air. It wasn't a reprieve. It was a message. "I see you." With trembling hands he had not had before, Andrei forced himself to finish. He sealed the case with the poisoned book inside, condemning his enemies to months of blindness. He had won. Project Grey Owl was secure. But as he left the room, the genuine cipher book a lead weight in his briefcase, he felt no triumph, only a deep, chilling certainty. The predator he had been eluding for years had just quietly entered the room, sniffed the air, and decided not to pounce. Yet. The hunt was no longer a game. It was a countdown. The victory felt like ash in his mouth. For 3 days, Andrei moved through the embassy like a man in a haunted house, every creak of a floorboard a warning, every glance from a colleague an accusation. Morozov's interruption in the secure room was not a random event. It was a seismic shift, a crack in the very foundation of his existence. The colonel's words, "I need your ears sharp," now sounded less like an order and more like a threat. He performed his duties with robotic precision. He gave a lecture on Soviet folk art to a group of uninterested diplomats. He filed reports on American cultural trends that he knew would be ignored. All the while his mind was a vault, replaying Morozov's face the way his fingers had touched the genuine cipher book. It was a game of cat and mouse, and for the first time, Andrei felt the shadow of the cat. His only solace was the dead drop, a chipped brick in a low wall near a quiet park. It was his single fragile tether to the world of Adam Rice. Tonight, under the cover of a light drizzle, he made the pass. A signal, prearranged. A single white piece of chalk on the third brick from the left. Compromise suspected. Stand by. The response came 48 hours later, in the form of a classified ad in the Washington Post, placed by a fictional landscaping company. It was a command, cold and simple. Proceed with Project Verdict. Initiate Phase 1. Phase 1. The most dangerous game. He was to subtly poison the well of intelligence he himself had contaminated. He had to fabricate a ghost, a plausible explanation for the tiny inconsistencies that he now feared Morozov was already sensing. His tool was the next batch of disinformation, coded messages hidden within the cultural reports he sent to the International Department of the Central Committee in Moscow. He crafted a narrative of minor, intermittent, signal degradation in certain North American cities. He suggested, in the driest bureaucratic language, that atmospheric conditions or localized American jamming efforts might be causing fleeting, minor errors in decryption, just enough to explain away any future anomalies a sharp analyst might find. It was a work of art, a lie woven with the thread of truth. He was building an alibi for his own treason. Meanwhile, in a windowless, smoke-filled office on the 4th floor of the KGB's Lubyanka headquarters, a different kind of mind was at work. His name was Yegor Sokolov, and he was an analyst, a ghost in the machine of the first chief directorate. He was young, pale from a lack of sunlight, and blessed, or cursed, with a mind that saw patterns where others saw noise. For weeks he had been studying the traffic from the North American networks. The success rates were perfect. Agent reports dovetailed with intelligence from other sources with an almost mathematical precision. Operations proceeded without a single significant security breach. On the surface, it was a testament to the efficiency of the KGB's tradecraft. But to Yegor, it smelled wrong. Espionage was a messy business, a human business. It was built on friction, on chance, on mistakes. This stream of flawless intelligence was sterile. It was as if someone was feeding them a story, a very good story, but a story nonetheless. He compiled his findings into a dry 10-page report. He avoided grand accusations. He simply presented the statistical anomalies, the unnatural symmetry of the data. He titled it, "A Preliminary Analysis of Signal Consistency in North American Agent Networks," and he sent it up the chain, expecting it to be buried in the bureaucracy. He was wrong. The report landed on the desk of a powerful and paranoid general in the Counterintelligence Directorate. It was the spark he had been waiting for. He authorized a quiet, top-secret investigation, giving it the ominous code name Operation Ghost Hunt. Its mandate was simple: find the source of the anomaly, find the ghost. The order went out to the most trusted field officer they had in Washington, Colonel Grigory Morozov. Morozov received the encrypted message in the privacy of his soundproofed office. He read it twice, his face a stony mask. The message from Moscow confirmed his own growing instinctual dread. He wasn't just paranoid. There was a sickness in his station, a cancer. He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the brightly lit American city he despised. He thought of the people in his embassy, the clerks, the drivers, the diplomats, and Andrei Volkov, the quiet, efficient cultural attaché who had been in that secure room, with 2 cipher books on his table. Morozov's phone rang, shattering the silence. He picked it up. It was the front desk. "Comrade Colonel, the car for the reception at the Swedish embassy is ready." "I will be down shortly," Morozov replied, his voice even. He hung up and took his formal dress uniform from the hanger. As he fastened the high collar, his eyes fell on a group photograph on his desk, his team taken a year ago. Andrei Volkov stood at the edge, his smile faint, his eyes unreadable. Morozov picked up a direct, secure line. He spoke 2 sentences to the man on the other end, the head of his security detail. "Increase surveillance on all non-core personnel. Start with the cultural section. I want to know who they talk to, where they go, who they breathe on." He put the phone down. The hunt was no longer a suspicion. It was an official order. And as he walked out of his office, a predator once more on the scent, the walls of Andrei Volkov's world began, silently and invisibly, to close in. The poison was in the air. Andrei could taste it. It was a metallic tang of suspicion that had seeped into the very fabric of the embassy. The change was subtle, invisible to most, but to him it was a screaming alarm. It began with the small things. His apartment, which he had left meticulously arranged, felt subtly violated. A book on his shelf was a centimeter out of place. The faint, lingering scent of cheap tobacco in his bathroom that wasn't his own. They were professionals, but so was he. They were searching for a ghost, and in doing so, they were leaving traces of their own. Then came the eyes. The junior KGB guard Petrov, who usually nodded with bored deference, now held his gaze a fraction of a second too long. The new cipher clerk, a woman with a face like a closed fist, seemed to be in the corridor every time he left his office. They were building a cage around him, one invisible bar at a time. The command from Langley was simple and terrifying. "Maintain cover. Do not break routine. You are a rock. Let the water flow around you." So he played his part. He attended the endless receptions, smiling and shaking hands with Western diplomats, all while feeling Morozov's gaze from across the room like a physical weight. He was a man dancing on a high wire in a storm, and every smile, every casual remark, was a fight for balance. The breaking point came during the weekly intelligence briefing for senior staff. Morozov stood at the head of the table, a bear of a man exuding controlled power. He discussed a recent, successful operation in New York, a political scandal the KGB had orchestrated, using intelligence from a highly placed source. Andrei listened, his blood running cold. The intelligence was his, a piece of brilliantly crafted disinformation he had fed to Moscow months ago. The highly placed source was a fiction. The scandal was a CIA plant designed to destabilize a political faction that was becoming too friendly with the Soviets. Morozov was praising him, unknowingly reciting the script Andrei had written. Then Morozov paused, letting the success hang in the air. His eyes scanned the room slowly, deliberately, before landing on Andrei. "A remarkable success," Morozov said, his voice deceptively soft. "Our source is a true asset. It makes one wonder, Volkov. In your cultural work, you meet many Americans. How is it that their secrets fall into our laps so easily? Are they truly so arrogant? So blind?" The room went quiet. All eyes turned to him. It was not a question. It was a trap, baited with professional curiosity. Andrei felt a bead of sweat trace a path down his spine. He took a slow sip of water, buying a precious second. He could not appear too clever, nor too stupid. "Arrogance, Comrade Colonel?" Andrei replied, his tone thoughtful, almost academic. "Perhaps. But I think it is fragmentation. Their society is a collection of voices, all shouting. It is easy to get lost in the noise. We are a single chorus. It gives us focus." He had given the perfect party answer. A platitude that sounded profound but meant nothing. A few heads nodded in agreement. Morozov's lips curled into something that was not a smile. "A single chorus," he repeated, his eyes locked on Andrei's. "Yes, but a chorus only works if every voice is in tune. One false note, and the entire performance is ruined." The message was delivered. The threat was made. The briefing continued. But for Andrei, the room had faded away. He was alone in the spotlight, his every breath a potential false note. That night, in the crushing silence of his apartment, the fear turned into a cold, clear strategy. They were closing in. Morozov was not just suspicious, he was building a case. The surveillance, the verbal traps, it was the methodical tightening of a noose. He couldn't just be a rock anymore. The water was rising too fast. He had to act. He had to give them another ghost to chase, a more tempting target to draw their fire. He had to sacrifice a pawn to save the king. He looked at the photograph on his desk, the one of him and his comrades at the May Day parade. His eyes settled on the face of a man named Dmitry Ustinov, a minor economic attaché. Dmitry was greedy, arrogant, and had a taste for Western luxuries he couldn't afford. He was the perfect candidate. A plan, cold and ruthless, began to form in Andrei's mind. He would use the very machinery of KGB suspicion that was hunting him to devour one of its own. It was a despicable act, a betrayal of a man who, while flawed, was not a traitor. But this was no longer about morality. It was about survival. The symphony of his grand deception was reaching a fever pitch, and to save it, he would have to conduct a movement of pure, unforgivable evil. The trap was set with the delicacy of a watchmaker and the cruelty of a spider. Andrei, using a one-time cipher pad provided for extreme emergencies, sent a message to Langley. The request was simple: create a financial trail. Small, untraceable deposits into a dormant Swiss account, linked to an alias that his research suggested Dmitry Ustinov had once casually used on a black market deal years ago. The bait was money, the oldest and most reliable weakness. Simultaneously, he began the verbal poison. In casual conversations in the embassy canteen, he would lament the high cost of Western electronics. He'd sigh. A man like Ustinov, he always seems to have the newest Japanese radio. I don't know how he manages on his salary. The remarks were always offhand, always plausible, designed to plant a seed in the fertile soil of the embassy's paranoia. The final piece was the masterpiece. He fabricated a low-level cultural report about American art galleries, but within the boring text, he embedded a coded message using the very same compromised cipher system he had created. The message, when deciphered by the KGB in Moscow, would read, "Package received, funds confirmed, awaiting further instructions for Northern Wind." The message was designed to be found, a breadcrumb, leading directly to a leak in the Washington station. He leaked it not through the usual channels, but by, accidentally, leaving the typed draft in a stack of papers meant for the incinerator, where he knew Morozov's security team periodically sifted through the trash. The reaction was swift and brutal. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Andrei was at his desk, pretending to work, when he heard the commotion down the hall, the sound of heavy, purposeful footsteps. A raised voice, quickly silenced. His heart was a cold, hard stone in his chest. He forced himself to walk out into the corridor. A small crowd had gathered. Morozov stood there, immaculate in his uniform, flanked by two stone-faced security officers. Between them, his face a mask of utter confusion and dawning terror, was Dmitry Ustinov. "This is a mistake," Dmitry stammered, his eyes wide, searching the faces of his colleagues for support. They all looked away. "Comrade Colonel, I am loyal." Morozov's face showed no emotion. "The evidence suggests otherwise, Comrade Ustinov. Your greed has made you a tool of the enemy." As the officers began to drag him away, Dmitry's panicked gaze swept the corridor and locked with Andrei's. For a horrifying second, there was a silent plea in his eyes. Then it was replaced by a flicker of stunned comprehension. He saw the calm, the detachment on Andrei's face. He saw the man who had lamented the cost of radios. In that instant, Dmitry Ustinov knew. He knew he was not being arrested for his own crimes, but for Andrei's. He opened his mouth to scream the accusation, but an officer clamped a hand over it, turning the sound into a muffled, animalistic grunt. Andrei held the man's desperate, knowing gaze until the very end, until they rounded the corner and Dmitry was gone. The corridor fell into a dead, sickening silence. Morozov turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shocked faces of the staff. They came to rest once more on Andrei. "A tragic day," Morozov said, his voice cutting through the silence. A reminder that corruption can fester in the most unexpected places. The chorus is now clean. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Andrei, before turning and walking away. Andrei stood there, the taste of bile in his throat. He had done it. He had saved Project Grey Owl. He had proven his loyalty to Morozov by sacrificing another. He was safe. He walked back into his office and closed the door. He did not sit. He simply stood in the center of the room, his entire body trembling. He had looked into the abyss of the system he fought, and to survive, He had reached in and pulled out an innocent man, throwing him into the darkness instead. The victory was complete. The ghost was safe. But the man, Adam Rice, felt something inside him shatter, a fracture in his soul that he knew would never, ever heal. The safe house was a silent, sterile box on the outskirts of Langley. It smelled of fresh paint and stale coffee. Adam Rice sat on a cheap sofa, the man known as Andrei Volkov, finally dead and buried. He was debriefed, praised, and given a new identity. He was a hero. The greatest intelligence coup of the Cold War was his legacy. But the victory felt like a phantom limb. He could sense its presence, but all he felt was a dull, persistent ache. The image of Dmitri's face, contorted in betrayed confusion as they dragged him away, was seared onto the back of his eyelids. He had saved Project Grey Owl by condemning an innocent man. He had won his war by becoming a monster. Years bled away. The Soviet Union crumbled. The wall fell. The world Adam had risked everything to shape finally arrived, and he found he had no place in it. He lived in a quiet Virginia suburb, a retired government pensioner with a past that didn't exist. His life was a perfectly arranged, still life, empty of meaning. The silence he now lived in was infinitely deeper and more hollow than the silence of the embassy. One day, a name surfaced in a declassified document a former colleague sent him as a curiosity. Yegor Sokolov, the analyst, the man who had started it all. The file noted he had emigrated to the United States after the collapse, a sought-after consultant on intelligence matters. He was living in Boston. A compulsion cold and undeniable took hold of Adam. He had to go. He had to look into the eyes of the man whose intellect had nearly destroyed him. The meeting was arranged under false pretenses. A retired American analyst wanting to discuss Cold War history. They met in a quiet corner of a Boston public library, sunlight streaming through tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Yegor Sokolov was older, thinner, his intensity softened by time and exile. He looked nothing like the formidable specter Adam had imagined. They spoke in pleasantries at first, and then Adam could no longer contain it. "Your report," Adam said, his voice low. "Operation Ghost Hunt. It was brilliant. You were the only one who saw it." Sokolov looked at him, his eyes sharpening, the analyst reawakening. He studied Adam's face, not as a retired American, but as a puzzle. "You know about that? It was not a popular theory. They called me a paranoid." "They were wrong," Adam stated flatly. A long silence hung between them. The sounds of the library, the distant rustle of pages, the hum of a vacuum cleaner, felt a million miles away. Sokolov leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There was a man in the Washington station, a cultural attaché. Volkov. I never had proof, not a shred. But I was sure. The pattern was elegant, like a beautiful poisonous spiderweb." He paused, his gaze turning inward, haunted. "They arrested another man instead, Ustinov. I argued. I said it was the wrong man, but they needed a body. And they got one." He looked back at Adam, a deep, profound sadness in his eyes. "I have lived with that for a long time. My brilliance, my pattern. It got an innocent man sent to a firing wall." Adam felt the air leave his lungs. The foundation of his own guilt shifted. This man, his nemesis, had carried the same weight, the same shame. They were two sides of the same tragic coin. "I heard Ustinov was executed," Adam said, the words ash in his mouth. Sokolov shook his head slowly. "No, worse. 20 years in a labor camp. He was released a broken man in the 90s. He died a few years later. A bottle of vodka and the cold. The truth was a physical blow. Dmitri had not been a quickly executed pawn. He had suffered for decades, his life ground away in the gulag, all for a crime Adam had engineered. Adam left the library and walked out into the crisp American afternoon. The sunlight felt alien. The freedom he had fought for felt like a mockery. He had achieved the ultimate victory. He had outwitted the entire KGB. He had changed the course of intelligence history. He found a quiet park bench and sat, watching the people, real people with real lives, untouched by his silent war. He thought of Katerina, the sister whose memory had fueled him. He had avenged her. He had broken the system that took her. But the cost was a man's life, brutally erased. He had won. But the ghost he had become had destroyed a life to save itself. The ultimate secret of Project Grey Owl was not its brilliant deception. It was the price of a single human soul. A price that could never be redeemed. He sat on the bench as the sun began to set, a hero in a story no one would ever truly know, forever trapped in the silence between the truth and the lie.